Hello and welcome to another exciting panel for the Pride of Week Festival. And this is the Intergenerational Talk with the girls like us, the trans women panel. I'm so excited to talk about this with a bunch of amazing trans women. First, my name is Noni Salma. I'm a writer and filmmaker originally from Nigeria. I live in New York. And with me, I have amazing women. First, I'm going to start with Miss Jordan Chenetsa. Hi, Jordan.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. It's good to have you here.
Thank you.
Also,
Thank you for having me.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, also, we have Dr. Anastasia Thompson. Hi, Doctor.
Hi, it's my pleasure to be here with you.
It's good to have you too. And also, we have Miss Zoe Black. Hi.
Oh, my mic is off. Hi, my mic is back on. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being here. And last but not least, we have, at least for now, unless someone pops in, we have Miss Ricky Go Sitao Kanza.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited as well to be amongst these amazing, powerful women.
Thank you. So to kick off this conversation, I think that one of the things that I want us to use to break the ice, I want to talk to Dr. Anastasia Thompson to for you when it comes to the trans medicine. What has been the greatest shift in the last, say, 5 years for you?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and it's certainly one that's going to be subject to some geographical interpretation. I'll speak from my experience as a clinician working in Cape Town, South Africa, and I think that we are starting to see a shift in the way that we provide gender-affirming healthcare as the medical establishment, from a model that's predicated more on gatekeeping to one that's founded, of course, on informed consent, where we are starting to respect people's autonomy and people's right to choose. And, this is not to say that we are where we need to be as yet. There are still many challenges and there is still far too much gatekeeping going on. But I think we are in a position where, at least in some isolated areas, we are starting to give people that respect for their autonomy, that respect for their identity, not to expect trans people to fit into a typical mold or image of what the ideal trans person looks like in order to access gender affirming care. And I think it's especially important because all too often that picture or ideal of trans experience has not been dictated by trans people themselves. It's been conceptualized by others looking through what is ultimately a cis-normative lens where, we've always had this approach to gender affirming healthcare of we are trying to make the trans body act and look and feel more like a cisgender body. And that, that is transphobic in and of itself. It serves to
Right.
erase and invalidate our identities.
Yeah, I think I like the fact that you talked about that even this progress is also depending on geography, and that I think of so much progress that we've made in America and all the Western countries, but also I think of some African countries that may not be there yet. Jordan, can you tell me, in your own experience in Zimbabwe, for example, what is the conversation like when it comes to trans healthcare, and are they at that level yet where Dr. Anastasia is talking about in terms of granting trans people the autonomy to determine what their transness is going to look like, or what their bodies are going to look like? Are they there
Mhm.
yet? And if not, what does that look like in Zimbabwe?
I think for now, in Zimbabwe, the idea of transness is still considered very new. And I mean new in the sense that there's not a lot of um, awareness of history. I guess people are not very, there's a lot of ignorance. Let me not say awareness. I think there's a lot of propaganda that was passed around by our former president, which went completely against the LGBTQIA plus community. And so for a long time, trans people were not even recognized as being valid. There was a very cis heteronormative ideal of existence, and anything beyond that was seen as like it was demonized, it was seen as less than, or like there was a statement made that even dogs and pigs are more normal than people from the LGBTQIA plus community. And that's someone who was in a position, that's the former president who made that statement. And right now, in terms of healthcare, we've just only just now started recognizing trans people because of the HIV and AIDS goal to
Mm.
eradicate HIV and AIDS. And so there was a categorization of MSM. I'm sure we all know what MSM is, which is men who have sex with men. And when the 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 HIV and AIDS, what is the word? The HIV and AIDS scheme,
Epidemic?
let me just say, scheme of healthcare. I'm sorry to say scheme, but the regime, let me say regime. When
Mm.
it came here, they recognized trans women only as MFM because there was a lack of understanding of the idea that anyone could be anything outside of cisgender. So if that makes sense. So when
Yeah.
someone like myself goes to a clinic to go and access healthcare, there's a lot of questioning like what are you doing? Are you trying to commit fraud? Your ID documents are, not matching up to the way that you present. There's um there's a lack of that understanding. So right now the healthcare system is only now beginning to recognize trans people, but only under the guise of HIV and AIDS,
Mm.
SRHR. Let me not even say SRHR. Let me just say SRH, which is sexual and reproductive health. There's no right. So yeah, I'll say that trans people are non-recognized. There's no laws that protect us. There's nothing.
Wow, that's a very illuminating insight. Zoe, what do you for your own experience living in South Africa, do you think that there's an evolution in the last 5 to 10 years in terms of trans medicine, and what does that look like?
I'm not sure if I can speak to the medicine aspect of it, but I do remember when I first came out, there was access to information was very scarce and very difficult to get hold of. And so a knock-on effect to that was that your access to healthcare was limited and your access to services were limited because you literally just didn't know. And so that made, for me, in my experience, very, very difficult to navigate, particularly my medical transition in that space. So that was really, really hard. And so I come from again, in my context, a middle class background. And so for those who are of less economic means, the struggle is even more real in terms of the lack of access to information, the lack of access to inclusive and affirming healthcare. And so that for me, if my memory serves me right, a few years ago was an issue. I think a lot of strides have been made in the last years in terms of inclusive healthcare for trans and gender diverse persons, and especially in advocacy spaces, there's been a very, very strong push to have medicine effectively depathologized in terms of trans identities and trans bodies.
Hmm. Interesting. I think something that Jordan even talked about that I just keeps ringing in my head is the idea of documentation for trans people. And I know that in the US, there are lots of organizations that help you. Well, in New York, because the laws are different in different states. But New York is very progressive, right? There are lots of organizations that can help you to do it, nonprofit organizations that can help you to do with your documentation name change free of charge. So it's kind of accessible. But at the same time, I always have to remember that it's not the same for other states in the US and even other countries outside of the US. But even that is something that here in New York has kind of changed in the last 10 years. It didn't used to be so So Ricky, can you tell me in your own experience if you um, know what the landscape is like, not just in South Africa, but also in Ghana? What's the trans movement like? What is it like for trans folks um, now as opposed to in the last 10 years? And do you even think that there's been any shift there? Because we're experiencing shifts here in the Western countries. But what is it like in our home countries? Is there been any shift in the last 10 years? And what does that shift for you look like? It could be in terms of policy, it could be, trans medicine, or just even trans people's understanding of who they are, language evolvement and all of that. What do you see that has the major shift that has happened in the last 10 years?
Certainly, thank you for that. So my background is in international human rights law, dispensation and protection. Like I said earlier on, part of my own background is also in using legal and policy reform as a tool for advancing equality, justice, and inclusion of greater LGBTI, but as well trans folk. So a lot of the work that for me I've done, I've been in trans-specific legal and policy advocacy spaces now for close to 14 years of my career. And a lot of shifts have been recorded, I would say, in the last 5 years, both with, if I look at my home country of Botswana itself, where the two cases, one of them being mine, that were won in the High Court, which was a 7-year litigation strategy that we took on to ensure that there was a constitutional interpretation of gender as inclusive of gender identity and expression, which then we got guaranteed by the High Court decision of 2017. Likewise, then in 2019, we were able to also even move a step further in getting the decriminalization of sections 164, 165, and 167 of the Penal Code of Botswana that criminalize consensual adult same-sex activity, which obviously has a certain implication on trans folk when applied, where I think, like Jordan was saying, in an African context, there's still quite a lot of education that needs to go into understanding and appreciating the differences between sexual orientation and gender identity, where many trans persons often find themselves at the receiving end of anti-sodomy legislation across the greater continent. But further to that, even in the South African context, last year, there was a litigation that had begun, even at the time that I was still an executive director, through an organization called Gender Dynamics that we had taken on for a trans person called Jay September, who was incarcerated and was serving a life sentence in one of the high maximum security prisons, who was denied access to gender affirming amenities within a prison context because she identified as a transgender woman, but initially having then begun her sentence, having been arrested and detained as somebody who was male assigned, of which then that court case, in conjunction with some of the litigation partners that we went with on the side, the LRC, I remember at the time, was around fighting for a constitutionally enshrined right to identify, which the Constitution of South Africa actually does protect. So there was also a further step beyond just the existing legislation and jurisprudence in South Africa, where there is an alteration of Sex Description and Sex Status Act of 49 of 2003 that ultimately also protects transgender persons to be able to access gender affirming or legal gender recognition and gender marker change. But like Anastasia was saying, we still have a problematic formulation of our laws that are very binary in that kind of conceptualization and formulation that expects trans persons to provide an affirmation of their identity from a medical expert in order for them to be able to legitimately claim to identify as they do, which is really problematic when you look at the greater dispensation of what is international gold standard of gender recognition law, such as countries like Argentina, for instance, where you have self-identification as a model through which you are able to get the legal gender marker change that you desire. And that was part of what also even informed my own litigation in Botswana, which was around not necessarily arguing the biomedical framework or determinants of my gender having been as is, which I identified as a trans woman who wanted a female gender marker on my, or female sex marker on my identity document. And arguing that the identity of an individual is inherently a part of providing dignity and respect to their very own identity, which is what we were able to then get as a confirmation from the High Court insofar as its interpretation of gender and sex as protected grounds against discrimination. But we've also seen across the greater continent a bittersweet kind of development in the last 10 years. In some parts, there has been progress, particularly in Southern Africa. We would notice that there's been a lot of shifts at legal and policy reform level. Last year, we had, at the beginning of the year before the decriminalization that took place in Botswana, Angola passed through a legislative reform process the decriminalization of consensual same-sex activity as well, which also provided for protections for sexual orientation and gender identity likewise. But to the greater extent within the continent, we've seen some regressions. Kenya had a similar matter in the High Court last year that was not successful, primarily just based on what we could ascertain as a prejudice of the judges that were sitting on the bench at the time, who, instead of arguing the merit of the unconstitutionality of the kind of penal provisions that are there that curtail all forms of non-conventional identities and expressions, rather argued that the discrimination that happens around anal sex, in that essence, was universally applicable to all citizens of the country. So it wasn't necessarily formulated to speak specifically to LGBT identities, but to anybody, including cisgender folk or cis heteronormative folk, who would want to also engage in anal sex, which is really, really fundamentally problematic in terms of that kind of jurisprudence that the court is setting. Although our own LGBTI community in Kenya are arguing an appeal against that very judgment, we are yet to hear what will come out of it. But I'm also quite inspired to have seen in Zimbabwe, where Jordan is sitting, a sister of mine, Ricky Nathanson, having won a case in the High Court as well in Bulawayo last year, that we began as far back as 2016, that was argued in court around wrongful arrest and detainment relating to her having used a women's bathroom because she identifies as trans as a woman, rightfully so, but she was then reported by somebody who worked in that hotel and ultimately incarcerated by the police under the guise of her impersonating a woman, in as such then that being constituted to be a part of a public nuisance, which is really ridiculous considering the fact that we essentially could be able to ascertain how far Ricky Nathanson had done a lot of the advocacy work, primarily having done a lot of the work in the southern part of Zimbabwe, engaging with the Department of Home Affairs, with immigration. She was a person who traveled quite a lot in and out of the country. So it really was problematic to see how at social level, the kind of social attitudes and perceptions that really still need to be dealt with. Hence, I'm a person who advocates for a two-pronged approach towards legal and policy reform, not only just focusing on the laws and the policies themselves, but also working to change and shift mindsets, hearts, and attitudes of people, because we need to be able to see those two marrying one another. And South Africa provides us for a case study where a failure to have done that, we sit with great laws, but we sit with a social dispensation where we are continuously seeing more and more murders and rapes of LGBTI persons, trans women, and lesbian women, which is really a lot of work that still needs to be done at the social level than anything.
That's awesome. I made a mistake. You're originally from Botswana, not Ghana, but
yes, that's
yes.
correct.
Yeah,
but I live in Cape Town, yes, and then a lot of my work is at Pan-African level with the African Union Commission and globally.
Cool. So for you, when you're having like discussions about the policies, I just want to understand. I know that you live in South Africa, but would you say that you're very conversant with the policies in Botswana when it comes to trans people, and also maybe Ghana? Just so I know like how to frame the questions.
No, definitely. I would say I'm quite familiar with a lot of legal framework around the whole entire continent. Like I said, a lot of my work is also at the African Union Commission, which is the Pan-African body that then directs development, human rights, and health-related development and policies across the continent. I am familiar as well within the West African context, which has been one of the sub-regions across the continent where there hasn't been enough of effort invested in, versus East Africa and Southern Africa, for instance, insofar as trans rights are concerned. So my organization, Accountability International, that I work for, is also doing some work in West Africa with supporting the West Africa Trans Forum as one of the emerging sub-regional entities that are fighting for inclusion of LGBT trans persons in the West Africa region. They're working primarily out of Liberia, but with partners across West Africa, inclusive of Ghana as well, inclusive of Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, and the others.
Great. I think that it would be remiss for me not to mention the cultural global impact that the Netflix series Orange is the New Black had globally in terms of this new discourse on trans movement, trans identity movement. I mean, it's always been there, but there was just a shift. I mean, you could attribute that to Netflix being a global force at the time. It still is, but how they kind of came into the market, that even though the work that has been done over the years that has still been done, that there's been a kind of new energy and attention that is being put into that. And even though that happened, I think that would be remiss for us not to understand that for a lot of people, it was still business as usual in terms of how trans folk are being treated. And I think that I'm curious, Jordan, did your experience being a Zimbabwe local or someone who's always lived there, did that permeate that kind of global change? And if it did, what are the changes that happened? Because I think it's important when we're having this conversation about the trans tipping point that happened after that, to also understand for a lot of places and a lot of people, nothing changed.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I don't really understand. Oh, I didn't get your question like 100%. Do you mind? Like, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it's fine. I'll
I'm
break it
so
down.
sorry.
I think
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about in terms of, and there's been so many different tipping points, but there was a huge tipping point when Orange is the New Black happened in 2013,
Okay.
that there became there's always been a discourse around trans identity, you know, even when Candice King did Dirty Sexy Money, but there was a new kind of deeper discourse that was not just about our bodies, that was not just about our anatomy, even though that was still happening on some, but there was a new we mean business discussion that started happening across the board. But I'm also trying to understand, did that even permeate to Zimbabwe, to Nigeria? I mean, you can talk about Zimbabwe because that's where you live.
Right.
Before then, what was the trans discourse like? And then after then, were people treating trans people differently because now they can see the humanity because of a TV show or because of the discussion around it? Or was it just business as usual? Was there any shift, even if it's little, do you think?
I don't think there was much of a big shift. I think maybe in the privileged parts of this country, which is not that huge, I think that a lot of people don't have the privilege to have access to shows like Orange is the New Black or Netflix even. I think that that's something that is restricted to maybe like middle class, like even middle class, like upper middle class to the higher class citizens. I don't think that a lot of people have access to
The show.
media like that, right, like Netflix. So for us, I think when those shows came around, there was talks of like, okay, this is an American thing. You know how everyone says, oh no, this happens in the US, this happens whatever. So for us, I think the bigger shift, the bigger tipping point for us that really started cause for conversation was Caitlyn Jenner becoming, Caitlyn becoming herself, coming out as herself. That was bigger news. That was more centered because it's right. It's Olympics. It's an Olympic champion, an Olympic legend, and Olympics is something that everyone knows. Like it's a global thing. It's something that everyone has access to. It's something that they would put in the news. And so I think that started conversations, but it was always those kind of conversations where it's like, no, this is a westernized thing. It's a Western mindset. It's not really a real thing. There was always the talk of, no, trans people don't really even exist in our country. And I can attest to that because for a lot of people, I am the first trans person that they've ever come into contact with, or the first trans person that they've ever had like a real conversation with. And so I can understand why people would say, no, this doesn't exist in our part of the world, because there is that thing of being stealth or not coming out or hiding yourself or choosing to present as a man in order to just get your daily tasks out of the way, just so that you can live your life peacefully. And then when you go back to your safe spaces, that's where you're able to present how you are. But for people like myself who have been presenting the way that I present and have been identifying the way that I identify, there was now sort of a pushback where people wanted to know, what is in your pants? Like, what are you? What kind of creature are you? Why are you choosing to do this? Why are you spreading this propaganda of identity politics? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So it did become very much so more violent. Violent in the sense of, like, let me not say violent, let me say aggressive. People became more aggressive when it came to trans identities. They wanted to know why I am trying to trick people, why we choose to like pretend to be women, or trans men pretend to be men. Do you know what I'm saying? So yeah, I think there was it in as much as there was uprising, it also opened the door for people to be able to come out, to feel comfortable, to see representation in the media. Do you know what I mean? Seeing someone like yourself, and that affirms identity, and it helps to show you that you're not the only kind of person to exist within your sphere.
Yeah.
I don't know, yeah. So I think it caused people to commune together, people like ourselves to commune together, and then it caused people on the outside to question, do these things really exist within
to be
our
more
society? Right.
I think that's a huge conversation, a huge discourse that's been had around disabilities. That sometimes disability is like a catch-22. On the flip end of that is the increase in violence that happens to trans folks. You know, like the year that Laverne Cox broke records by being the first openly trans person to be nominated for an Emmy, trans women, Black trans women were disproportionately murdered. So it's like you're looking at this, there is visibility and there is progress, but there's still people in the community, poor Black and brown people, who have been harmed at disproportionate numbers. So I think that it's good to honor the flip side of that conversation. Anastasia, I'm curious for you, what do you think, this whole conversation about tipping point, and maybe you can talk about it from medicine or not, or maybe just personal as a trans woman. What are the moments in time in the last 10, maybe the last 10, 15 years, whichever you can answer to, that you can say, this has been the tipping point. This is kind of changed the conversation. This has made a lot of change societally. Which ones would you be able to talk about?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna echo what Jordan said a little bit earlier, in that certainly Caitlyn Jenner made the news, and it seems like there was a lot of cultural awareness around it. I think following Caitlyn, I think perhaps the next big or significant kind of tipping point, as you say, certainly there was Laverne Cox, as you mentioned. Orange is the New Black was a big deal, but also recognizing that not everyone has access to the media and to those forms of representation. But I almost see the conversation as having moved over the past 10 or 15 years, as you say, from these individual incidents that we had. There was there was, I mean, dating back to the stories about Christine Jorgensen back in the 60s or whenever it was, you know, it used to be these isolated events. It was Caitlyn Jenner, then it was, you know, the release of the Danish Girl, and you know, we simultaneously saw with that piece of media two sides of the coin, where on the one hand we had some representation in film, and on the other hand, it was this hugely problematic kind of representation where we actually reinforced the stereotype of that a trans woman is in fact a man, because we had a cisgender man playing the lead role. And you know, it was so divisive because on the one hand, so many of us were just so glad to see something that represented even just a fraction of our experience, but there was the conflict that we all felt about it, because you know, this isn't really pushing the conversation forward in meaningful ways. And the difficulty being that mainstream society at large is going to see this and take it in a different way than the way that we take it. And you know, the examples of representation moving forward, you know, you've got Orange is the New Black, you've got Sense8 with Jamie Clayton, you've got Jen Richards doing a web series called Her Story, you've got this massive documentary now on Netflix called Disclosure, where actually trans people are for the first time kind of telling their own stories in their own words and speaking about all of the damage that's been done. And we're actually getting to a point now where you can almost find media where there will be inclusion of trans characters, but where it won't focus or pivot on that trans experience and all of the damage. You know, I look at the difference between the new iteration of the L word and the original iteration of the L word, where the handling of the character Max, the trans man, was so problematic and just so toxic. So there definitely is this movement, but I think the shortfall, and certainly as we sit here as a group of African women from diverse experiences and backgrounds and living in different parts of the world, is that we haven't got to the point where I think enough African trans people are telling their own stories in their own words, where they are directing the way that the stories are told, where they are producing those TV shows or those documentaries or that kind of media. And I think that in this part of the world, certainly the conversation is still delayed. You know, we're starting to gain this global consciousness over trans identity, but we're still at the point here where it becomes acceptable to say to someone, so are you a man? Are you a woman? What's in between your legs? You know, as if I have a right to this understanding of your anatomy, of your biology, of your physiology, of all of these very intimate personal details about yourself, instead of just being able to speak your truth and tell your story. And I think that's the next tipping point that we have to come to. The next tipping point is that we'll be telling our own stories, and so many more voices are going to be heard. And you know, certainly this is something I have to reflect on. You know, I have to own my own privilege in this space. I mean, I have the white skin and the college education, the medical degree and all of that. And, you know, certainly in South Africa, I was privileged. I managed to have an autobiography picked up by one of the biggest nonfiction publishers in South Africa. And, you know, I wouldn't have had that without the privilege that I've got. But that was, you know, that was 4 years ago now. And I have to start thinking, what's my role in building the community and getting other voices to be amplified, you know. And I think this is somewhere where certainly the perspective of someone like Zoe will be very useful. You know, Zoe, who is out there creating content and who is taking that into her own hands. So I for one would be very interested to hear Zoe's views on this.
Yeah, Zoe, I mean, I'd love to hear your views too, about this whole discussion about tipping point. And I think that one name that has come out a lot, I think also is about access, right? It's the Caitlyn Jenner story. Everyone could access that story, whether or not you were poor or not, because it was on TV, it was on newspapers. You know, you didn't need to have a Netflix account to access that story. And also that it wasn't a whole series that you had to follow through. It was um, one woman's perspective on our journey, but also one woman who had a huge influence and a huge career trajectory, and whose story was kind of subverting what we had been conditioned to understand about gender. So I'm curious about your perspective, Zoe. What do you think has been the hugest, the biggest tipping point for you, experience in your own experience? What has been the biggest tipping point? And do you agree with what Anastasia and Jordan has referenced to, or do you have a different perspective?
I think I would echo both Jordan and Anastasia's perspective. I think for me, a lot of access to representation and access to visibility does speak to your economic means very much in the context where I'm from. And so when it comes to shows like Netflix, platforms like Netflix and shows like Orange is the New Black and then Sense8, which was also a Netflix production, uh, the people who were able to access that, at least in South Africa, were people of economic means. And so it was very difficult to see yourself represented in media unless you had access to that kind of thing. For me, one of the things that I particularly remember about, for me coming out specifically, and I tell the story all the time, is that when I came out, I struggled because I struggled to access narratives that were similar to mine. While there was relatively accessible content from the USA, from UK, and from Australia, there were little to no local South African narratives that I could latch onto, that I could identify with. And so suddenly that made everything so much harder. There was no way that I could access particular types of information. I couldn't even speak to somebody because I just didn't know anyone. And so that was really, really difficult. And so one of the things that decisions that I had made for myself personally was that I made a deliberate decision to be visible and to be public on my social media, just about my broad experience around being trans. And it was really, really, the response was really great, firstly, but also it was very, very interesting because for a lot of people that I knew, I was the only trans person that they knew. And so for a lot of cisgender people, they were suddenly seeing a world through a different perspective and a different lens. And so that for me speaks to visibility in a very specific kind of way, where we talk about being visible in these effectively like high-end platforms, so in film, in television. But when it's really down to those local nitty-gritty individual experiences that you can see yourself in, whether it's paging through a magazine and seeing somebody who is trans, or where it's you're watching a local television station and I don't know, one of the ads has a trans woman in it. So that kind of representation is very, very much lacking, at least in our context, in South African context. And so there's a lot of work to be done in that kind of space. We do have representation, and like Anastasia did say, with things like the Danish girl, and while that was highly, highly problematic in that context, I think there were spaces where we were so desperate for representation and the telling of our narratives that it was almost like a little bit of a settling for, okay, we'll take it, you know, these crumbs, we'll take the crumbs. But I think we are slowly broadening the scope of that conversation for not only for trans representation and trans visibility around trans narratives specifically, but there were narratives around trans identities are not necessarily localized and focused on the narrative of being trans, but rather as just being an experience of a regular human being. There are now shows coming out being released where the trans characters are playing characters that are not necessarily centered around their transness. They're just people playing people, which is an amazing step for me to see, particularly like in mainstream film and television. So I do think we have come a very, very long way in terms of representation, but I think a lot of that needs to now filter down into effectively the groundwork in our local kind of media and our local kind of representation.
Wow, thank you. That was well said. I think that when we talk about the tipping point conversation. And I think maybe because I live in America, we're always looking at these global figures. But also, like you've said, that people who don't have access to that. And so they look within for people who, can show them a glimpse of who they are. And Ricky, I'm curious for you as someone who has made a lot of impact in terms of legislation, even in Botswana. Do you think that you were a tipping point for the people there who may not have access to local figures and people who can show them what's possible? That it's not just enough to accept crumbs, right? It's not just enough to to accept what has been deemed a status quo. That you can challenge it, and then you can win. Do you think that were a tipping point for that? And what are the things that you think that you kind of disrupting the scene in that way as cause for the local community, and how people have conversations about themselves? What do you think that has done?
No, certainly. It's always weird. I do not know how to be able to sound my own horn, but I definitely have to accept
Go
it.
ahead, do it.
Well, I'm getting comfortable with having to acknowledge the contributions that I've also made, and honestly, just being able to take stock of the little bricks I've put on the wall to building a better kind of world for other trans persons, particularly when looking at both in the Botswana context, where I and the other anonymous trans person were friends who came together really at the time where in 2011, there had not been any kind of legal precedents that had been set regarding trans persons being able to access legal gender recognition and gender marker change. And I did at that point in time realizing that I carried the baton not just for myself, but for a lot of other communities of trans diverse persons in the country, but also to pave way for other younger and upcoming trans diverse and gender diverse folks, because then I could not imagine having to coexist with the status quo as it was back in 2011 when we began our litigation, and coexisting with the scenario where trans persons continuously are in the higher echelons of persons who are living with clinical depression, who are more likely to die from suicide because we live in a world that does not affirm or see us as equals. So I do think that the visibility that we raised with our case, especially that mine was premised on as a social or community centered litigation that was meant to benefit communities like myself, we had to engage with media and we had to put ourselves out there, and more especially with myself coming from a family that had affirmed me as a little trans girl and raising me that way according to my identity. It was imperative on my side to have to use that privilege in a very responsible way, where I knew and understood that with this kind of great privilege, there came a huge burden of responsibility as well, to be able to ensure that then I used that privilege that I had to open more privilege for other trans persons. So we engaged a lot with media. I had to continuously tell the story of my life about how I knew I was a girl, at what age I was a girl, and having to endure even the kind of indignation that comes with media inquisition about things like, when did you know you were different? And you find that there is a cis privilege that is very violent, that asks and demands of trans persons to have to tell their gory details of how we have come out, how we declared our transness. When did we know we were different, or when did we know that we were trapped in bodies that did not represent us, which are all these very violent constructs that I've realized in mainstream media existed about trans persons, and having to open a doorway to having a different kind of engagement with trans persons, where I wasn't going to sit there and have to play the pity party that feel sorry for me, that I knew I was different. I knew I was a girl for as long as I was a kid, until society and social constructs that I fell into negated my being a girl. And it's a different kind of conversation that I needed to take insofar as the media portrayals at that time around trans persons. And fast forward in 2019, 2020 is why I also then took the responsibility to also become a columnist with one of the national papers in Botswana, the Botswana Gazette. I have a column, a fortnightly column titled Queer Eye, as in this very eye itself, but speaking to the individual, that provides greater cis community an opportunity to be able to look at the world with our own lens and to be able to see the world in the way that we navigate it as gender variant and gender diverse individuals. And with that, I've realized how there are individuals who, as woke as they are still very binary in the thinking, even just about transness as this binary oscillation between male and female from one end to the other, without understanding even the plethora of the diversity that's contained within transness. Hence, I continuously invigorate the language of trans-diverse individuals in spaces that I'm in to help people understand and really appreciate that even trans folk are not just trans men, trans women, because that's where most people often finish the conversation about us. For them to understand trans non-binary persons, to be able to understand trans individuals that are gender fluid, to understand people who are bigendered, and the whole spectrum that is contained within transness. And fast forward, I'm at a point where I'm busy as well with my own maiden autobiography that I'm hoping by end of year will be done, as an acknowledgement on my part of the fact that we need more and more stories of ourselves, more especially from my perspective as a trans woman who is Black, African, who also has to not only just grapple with this legal system that is very binary or the medical system that's binary, but there's the binarism and the gender essentialism that is contained within African traditional customs and practices. But I found myself having existed in those kind of spaces, but being affirmed still within a very rural kind of setting in Barolong Farms where my family originates, and having existed within an affirming environment and feeling the need to have to tell that narrative. Because one of the things that I experienced that is very new, and I have not seen it done for any other person, was when my family decided to rewrite the culture of Botswana. When I now completed my processes that I had chosen for myself to affirm myself through with my gender affirming surgery in 2016, beginning of 2017, my family did a welcome ceremony, a traditional ceremony that was led by my uncles, my aunts, my grandparents, that was meant to welcome me now fully as the woman that I had been telling them that I am, and now embodying that womanhood and celebrating it, where they invited every single person you can imagine that my family has contact with, from their own colleagues at work, people who went to school with my own brothers and with my other siblings and my cousins, to people just around, elders around community, including even the chief who was also there of our region, to just come and affirm to them that we love our child. She is trans and we are very proud of her, and that our culture is something that needs to continuously evolve to be able to embrace the changes that come with the society. And being that Ricky is here, she is a testament to the fact that we have children like her that we as a society are challenged with having to see how do we ensure that they also can get to live dignified and safe lives. And my family used that as an opportunity to educate a lot of people around. And we're in negotiation with some other partners that I can mention right now to turn that book itself and my life story into a film that is meant to also help us portray ourselves and to help a little kid who is somewhere in Tanzania, which is one of the very repressive countries right now, be able to see somebody like me, like themselves, like me, who is there, who they're able to say, but she's African. She comes from a rural background. She also comes from even a Christian family, but there she is. She's been affirmed and she's been loved to the greater degree that even within a church setting, I'm a person who is continuously challenging my own denomination, which is the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, to challenge its own doctrine and our own liturgy itself around where does God sit within the diversity that God has existed. Because I sit here now as a trans woman who's also a person who's called to ministry. I'm in a journey of preparing to one day then become a minister in the Methodist Church, and sitting in that space that really has been a hostile and violent kind of tool that has been used to ostracize and to violate LGBTI persons and trans persons. I coming in with what I understand to be queer theological thinking, that I'm now seeing more and more of my visibility that is igniting other ministers within the church who are embracing of diversity, who are inclusive-minded insofar as continuously providing pastoral care and support to even LGBTI persons. So visibility for me is really, really key. And I think in an African context, we definitely still have a lot to do, but there has been quite a lot of developments in making sure that then we tell our narratives. Books like Anastasia's book, people like Landa Mabenge, who've also written the book Becoming Him, are part of those kind of capturing and documentation and portrayals of African indigenous experiences of LGBTI and trans persons,
Wow.
which I think are important to continuously telling.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so proud of all the cultural shifts that you've been able to make for the movement locally. I think that it's important to have people like yourself who can come out and challenge the status quo, and not just do that for themselves, but just do that for all the young trans women and trans folks who are going to come forward later, and they're going to enjoy the dividends of the big fight that you've fought. So I just want to say thank you for that. And to round up with our other guests, I just want to quickly ask Jordan, then Anastasia, and Zoe. Jordan, shortly just tell me, what's your hope in terms of where we go from here? What changes do you want to see in Zimbabwe, for example? And I know that for me personally, for Nigeria, one thing that I would love to see is for there to be a recognition that trans folk exist, because right now I feel like people don't even look at them as trans. They're all lumped as you said, MSM or gay folk across the spectrum of trans people. And I think that I would love for us to get to a point where people are being viewed as who they say they are. So I'd like to hear from you. Quickly, what's your hope for the community in Zimbabwe?
Okay, for myself, I would love to see, like you said, constitutional recognition of our existence as trans people. I would love to see constitutional protections for people like ourselves, where if someone like me or you were to encounter any danger or discrimination, we could take it up in a court of law because we are protected by the legislation within our country. I think that it's also a big thing for me to see gender affirming healthcare for trans people. So I hope that trans people will be able to have access to hormones, hormone replacement therapy. That's something that we don't have. And a lot of trans people are hurting themselves because we have to access our hormones from the black market, and we essentially have to self-prescribe, self-diagnose, whatever. And so yeah, I would love to see more community amongst trans people within our country, trans people feeling like they have someone that, a sense of community amongst each other and amongst ourselves. I think I'd also just love to see cultural understanding, because that's a big thing in Africa, is that there's not a lot of cultural reverence when it comes to queer people and LGBTQIA plus people. And I think that yeah, I think I would love to see a challenge when it comes to people challenging cultural norms, to show that historically LGBTQIA plus persons have been existing and have been around, and it just hasn't been classified in the terms that we use today because obviously information wasn't as accessible. So yeah, also that information, I'd love to see information becoming more accessible to people who are within the lower class of the country, so that it's not just people who are in the upper class who have access to options when it comes to gender identity.
Great, great. Zoe, I see you nodding your head. What do you have anything that outside of what you said that you're hoping would be part of the new, if you will, tipping point for the movement in South Africa?
In South Africa, we do have the protection of the Constitution and various pieces of legislation that do protect queer rights to a certain extent. And so while there has been a lot of work in that area, for me, I think my hope would be that there would be a greater shift in our social spaces, in terms of how our communities and how our friends and our families and the people that we engage with on a day-to-day basis see queer people and see trans people specifically. And that's how I think how we're going to build allyship and stuff. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done socially in that space. So I think that's where my hope is currently.
Me as well, me as well. And last but not least, Anastasia, we're being hopeful here, and I hope you are too. And what are your hopes for? I know that we've made a lot of progress, but we still have a long way to go. What are the things that you're hoping to see as quickly as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I have a wish list. It's quite an extensive wish list. But a couple of the highlights, you know, in terms of media and representation, I mean, I'd love to see trans actors and actresses playing cisgender characters and that not being a big deal. In terms of access, I'd love for gender affirming care to be available on people's doorstep, that you shouldn't have to go seek out someone who's got special expertise and skill and training and sensitivity and competence, that you could show up at your local clinic and have access the same way that you would have access to any other kind of medical treatment. And I'd really like to see the right to self-determination. And, you know, I think part and parcel with this comes the recognition and validation of identities outside the binary. You know, I think we speak about documentation and IDs and university certificates or schooling certificates or driver's licenses or whatever. And, you know, I think we have to move past the point where we are rooted in, is it M or is it F? If it's one, it cannot be the other. Certainly, it cannot be neither. It cannot be both at the same time. And to say that this binary concept is so flawed and we need to radically rethink that. So I'd really love to see that entire dynamic sort of rebuilt from the ground up to just reflect adequately the expansiveness of human identity, and to realize that you can't pigeonhole people into these little check boxes that you put on your forms.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank my wonderful panelists, Jordan, Chanitza, Anastasia, Zoe, and Ricky. Thank you so much for your insightful conversations. I hope that, you know, going forward, that these conversations, of course, would always would make people the conversations that we have. And I hear that Miss Sahara is here, even though the panel is over. I just like had to drop a word to kind of round this conversation over. Hi, Miss Sahara. We're just ending the panel. You have to unmute yourself.
Hello. Hi.
Hi. And Miss Sahara is a trans woman who's originally from Nigeria, but she lives in the UK. So we're just rounding up the panel, but you know, like my conversation is, what are your hopes for the trans movement in Nigeria? I know we've made a lot of progress in the Western world here, but for Nigeria in terms of, or even Africa, we've had a lot of tipping points, you know, globally. What are the tipping points that you're hoping to see in the continent when it comes to trans folks?
Oh, there's so many. I think I'll just be echoing what everybody have already said, which is gender recognition laws. That is very much important, but I don't see that happening any soon. No offense. We can dream of it all we want, but many countries, especially where I come from, Nigeria, that won't be happening any soon. That's for sure. But it would be great if we can have gender recognition laws and we can have SOGI bills, because SOGI bills is the anti-discrimination laws that needs to protect LGBT people. And I think people confuse SOGI bills just for LGBT people. They forget that it also protects all citizens against discrimination and against harassment and against denial of services and opportunities at work. So we need two things, SOGI bill and gender recognition laws. If we have that, it would be great. But I don't see that happening. I think the only thing that may happen, the way it's going to change, we need to have a cultural shift. Yes, we have the internet. Internet is helping. But socially, you know, we have a few trans people who are very popular in Africa who are doing amazing things. But religiously, that is still very much impossible due to I always call it the colonial religion, and how we have been so badly brainwashed to judge our own people based on imported religions. So we need to really reflect and try to change people around us. We need to educate people around us with the hope that it will influence them. But how can you influence a change when the people who are meant to be listening to us are not wanting to listen to us? You can't force a horse to a river and force the horse to drink from that river. The horse have to be willing to drink from that river. So how do you educate your own people if your own people refuse to listen to you or refuse to give you even a voice or a platform? So, for example, I'll give you an idea. MultiChoice, which is one of Africa's biggest cable network company, because Nigeria holds the largest viewing public. Nigeria and Nigerian Commission, Nigeria Broadcasting Commission, NBC, holds immense power and wields immense power over what continental Africa watches. For that reason, Jazz and Caitlin, those two shows were cancelled. Jazz was called a porn, a gay porn, by Nigerian media, Nigerian bloggers, for goodness sake. This is how badly educated our people are. So I think the first thing we need to do is start educating people, and we need to influence and lobby TV channels, especially people like MultiChoice, by them putting their foot down, not putting profit before equality, and allowing LGBT TV shows to air and allowing LGBT people on television so that continental Africans can see that we are normal. When we talk about visibility, we need the media. We can't do it without the media. Doing it on social media alone is not enough, but we need the mainstream media. And the only way we can do that is when we're being given opportunities to work on television, work in newspapers, where we can influence change and also control the narrative that are being put out about us. I think that's the only way we're going to make change. Sorry, I'm going on for long.
No. I think you know, we didn't have enough time to get a lot of your input. So I think it's important for all of the things you're saying now. I think that's good to hear your perspective, and I always wanted to hear your perspective. I think that you're one of the leading forces when it comes to the trans movement in Nigeria, and I think that for a lot of people, visibility is important. We need more people, but also it's important that we have those that we have at least. That they can't say that we are an anomaly, that we don't exist, because we do. But also people need to know that. More people need to know that. More people need to see that.
They need to see that we exist. They need to see that we exist. That was why I came out. In hindsight, maybe I wouldn't have come out. I wasn't planning on coming out. I wasn't planning on being an activist, because I don't like using that word. I prefer to use an educator and as a teacher, because I think people react more when you try to educate them instead of talk at them and try to force your views on them. So I came out because one Nigerian in 2009 or something, one Nigerian pastor, Anglican pastor or something, going on about how there is no LGBT in Nigeria. They shouldn't be talking about such demonic, they always put demonic views on it. And I was like, that's it, I'm going to come out. I'm going to show these people that we exist. So I went on international stage to expose myself on national television in the UK. I wasn't prepared for it. And this is one thing I would say to young African girls coming up who are trans. Think very carefully before you jump into the deep sea, because you don't know you don't know how the media is going to react to you. If you're not strong emotionally, if you're not physically and emotionally strong enough to handle the negativity and the hate the vitriol that is going to be channeled towards you, then don't come out, because it doesn't matter it doesn't mean that you're not valid. Of course you're valid. Not everybody is strong enough to handle the media. And again, for you coming out doesn't mean that you're going to be rich. It doesn't mean you're going to buy a house and buy a car. Everything I have in my life wasn't because I was in media or because I came out or I'm a celebrity. Everybody, I want to be a celebrity. Oh, look at me, I have a sugar daddy. Oh, look at me, I have bigger ass, I have this. But that doesn't pay bills. That is the truth. It doesn't pay bills. You can have millions of followers. That doesn't pay bills. What pay bills if you have education, you go to school and you have something tangible, and you have gender recognition laws, and you have job opportunities, and people are giving you job opportunities. That is what pays bills. So we need to instill this in our young girls, because I noticed the young girls we have in Nigeria at the moment are emulating certain people who give very shallow view of what it means to be trans. And they often think that it's easy, you know, all you need to do to be a trans person is to be a whore, or to be, not that there's anything wrong with being a whore. I like looking like a whore, as you can see. So there's nothing wrong with it. But the truth is, there is more to it than that. It doesn't pay bills unless you have to fight for it. And the only way, unfortunately, I would say to my Nigerian sisters is leave the country. I know it's not easy. It's not easy. Many people say to me, oh, you know, don't advocate that. But I would advocate it. Leave. Because it's not safe. They're locking them up, beating them up, and harassing them every single day as they walk out the street. I see videos, I have videos on my computers of intersex person being stripped naked and using a gun to check to see the genitalia, to trans women being, because they're dressed up, they're beaten up and stripped. The same thing that happened to me when I was in Nigeria. It's happening to them. And I look back and I'm like, you have to leave. You have to leave. The problem is, how do we get them out? How do we get them out? This is one of my mission, is to lobby European Union governments to make it easier, an easy pathway for LGBT people to escape from violent situation when they are in home countries that are super LGBT phobic. And this is one thing I think Pride of Africa and other LGBT African organization can advocate for. For those trans and LGBT people that want to stay back in continental Africa and strong enough to handle the pain and the vitriol, fine. But there are so many people who cannot handle it. So, and there's so many people who are not emotionally strong enough for it. So we need to make a way for them. And that is my, that is one thing I worry about a lot.
Thank you so much. I just want to say that, you know, I know you have like second thoughts about, oh, maybe I shouldn't have come out, but I'm grateful that you did, because for me, we talk about all these tipping points, Laverne Cox and the in Janice. I think for me, locally, you were a huge tipping point for me at a time when I needed to be someone, and I needed to have that, to know that, you know, this is not just something that's in the West. That there is I have a sister from Nigeria who's trans, and you know, maybe I didn't even have the audacity at the time, but you know, I had that, you know, it was tangible. I'm grateful that you exist, and I hope that that I can do that. I can do the same thing for other girls, because I feel like we need.
You are. Thank you so much for that. That's so sweet. But you are already. You are doing it. You've been visible. It's a testament to the incredible strength you're giving to our community. And this is why, okay, so I get a lot of people, oh, what have you done for us? You haven't done anything for us. You're not sending us money. Because many of the girls expect me to send them money or buy them flight ticket to move to the UK. And I said, I'm not that rich, which is true. I mean, look glamorous doesn't mean that I'm rich. So I'll just be honest with you. I'm not going to pretend and be online and be lying that, oh, my sugar daddy did this and sugar daddy does that. It's not true, because I'm not that kind of girl. And the truth is that we as a community, being visible, you, Amanda, and all the other girls who are from Nigeria, and even Africa, like Ricky and all the other girls who I've met, even through Miss Trans Global, Sema Kaling and all the other girls I've met online from all continental Africa. It makes me so proud, especially the girls who, all these amazing women that are in panel today, who are actually living in continental Africa. I always say that for me, they're my heroes, because they are living in face of pain and facing the vitriol that I left behind. They're still there. They're the heroes of this whole movement. And then having the audacity to be visible alone, that is just incredible. As in, like, I find it amazing, and I'm inspired by them every single day. Sometimes when I feel like, oh, I don't even want to do this anymore, I just want to go stealth and just live my life quietly, because my mom keep pressuring me to do that, because one, it's affecting my job ability, it's affecting my mental health, and it's affecting everything. It affects everything once you're out, and then people talking, writing trash, it affects you, especially when people Google your name. What they see is horrible things. It affects you in one way or the other. So that is why I advocate for trans women to be very, or trans people in general, should be very careful before they out themselves. Just be very careful. Don't do it because you think you want to be famous. Don't do it because you think you get money. Do it because you're strong enough to handle the pain, and do it because you can counteract all the things that you get. You are able to have that energy to fight back when they give it to you. I wasn't prepared for it. I honestly did not know that it was going to go nuclear until it happened to me. So I always use people to use me as a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
I'm very flattered you said that, but thank you also for being visible, because I'm grateful for you girls, all of you on the panel, and all my other Black and African sisters and white sisters who come from continental Africa. Being visible is a revolutionary act.
Thank you so much. I feel like this is such a powerful note to end on. I feel like we've had wonderful tales on just even what people want to see, but having also this cautionary, this kind of warning and guidance from you, Sahara, I think is very important. I want to thank every one of you, Miss Sahara, Jordan, Anastasia, Zoe, Vicky. Thank you so much for making this panel a wonderful one. And for everyone who's watching the Pride of Feet Festival, I hope that you keep tuning in. This is not the end of it. Thank you for sticking with the panel, and I remain your wonderful moderator, Nami Sama. And hopefully, I get to see you during the course of the festival. Bye.